What would you do if your husband found out you lied about being married to chase your boss? I thought I was in control, but then legal papers arrived at my door. Now I'm wondering if I ruined my life for nothing. My name is Aurelia Dane. I am 34 years old, and I work as an office manager in a busy corporate building where I spend more hours pretending to be indispensable than actually doing anything that matters, which in a way made it the perfect environment for my lies to grow and spread. My husband Ethan is 36 and works as an accountant who has always been steady, predictable, and far too serious about rules and numbers, which made me feel like he was dragging me down while I still wanted excitement. For a long time, I told myself that he lacked passion, that he was too quiet and too focused on order, but I ignored the truth that he was loyal and devoted in a way most women would envy. When Jake Hale, my 41-year-old director, started noticing me at the office and complimenting my energy and work ethic, I felt alive again, and I convinced myself that I deserved his attention, even if it meant hiding that I was already married. I began leaving my ring in my purse and telling everyone I lived alone, because I wanted to seem free and desirable instead of tied down to a man who spent evenings balancing spreadsheets. My mother Marion supported my independence and often told me Ethan was dull, while my younger sister Claire warned me I was making dangerous choices. But I brushed her off and laughed that she was simply jealous. Ethan's brother Peter always watched me carefully at family dinners, and I could feel his quiet judgment, but I pretended it did not matter because everyone still thought I was the one with the upper hand. Looking back now, I can see how many chances I had to stop before things went too far, but at the time, I felt powerful, keeping a secret from Ethan, and I believed he would never discover the truth. What I did not realize was that Ethan was patient observant and far stronger than the quiet man I had convinced myself was weak, and the day those legal papers arrived proved just how wrong I had been about him. At first, the whole thing started so small, and I honestly thought I could control it. But looking back now, I can see how the smallest lie opened the biggest wound, and how fast everything slipped out of my hands. I was at the office the morning it began, sitting at my desk, with files stacked high, pretending to be busy, when Jake Hale walked by and smiled at me, like I was more than just another employee lost in paperwork. Jake was 41, confident, successful, the kind of man who carried himself like every room already belonged to him, and I wanted that light to shine on me for once. So when he asked casually if I lived alone, I nodded and said yes, as if it were the most natural truth in the world. I told myself it was harmless because Ethan was far away in his world of ledgers and numbers, and I deserved a little attention after all these years of being invisible in my own marriage. From then on, the lie grew legs and followed me everywhere in the office halls and conference rooms. I was no longer a wife or a mother. I was just Aurelia, the independent woman who could stay late for meetings or join Jake for lunch without ever checking a clock. Each time I slipped off my ring and tucked it deep into my purse, I felt that rush of being wanted again, and I told myself Ethan would never even notice, since he hardly looked up from his laptop most evenings. At a family dinner that week, I made a joke about Ethan being too boring to come with me to company events, and my mother Marion laughed in agreement, saying he was too stiff for my energy, while my sister Claire frowned and asked if I wasn't being unfair. I brushed Claire off by saying she always overthought things and told her maybe she should find a man of her own, before judging mine, which silenced her, though I caught Peter's eyes fixed on me with clear suspicion. Ethan himself sat quietly at the table, letting the noise of my mother and children fill the space, while I leaned back smug that everyone thought I was the one keeping life exciting. Later that night, Jake called me just to ask about a report, and we ended up talking for nearly an hour about nothing important. Yet my pulse raced the entire time. Ethan walked into the room just as I was laughing into the phone, and though I quickly said it was only work, he stayed silent and his jaw tightened in that way that told me he had noticed more than I wanted. I spun the moment by telling him he was being paranoid, and that Jake valued my skills, unlike some people at home who only saw me as another expense on their tax sheets. He said nothing in return, but the silence carried a weight that unsettled me, even though I pretended to ignore it. At the office the next day, Jake asked again if I really lived alone, And I smiled and told him, of course I did, and that marriage had never worked out for me, because men were often intimidated by my independence. He laughed and seemed impressed, which only fueled my need to keep up the story, and soon I was sharing small jokes with him during meetings, while Ethan's texts, asking what time I'd be home, went unanswered. At another family gathering, I used Ethan as the punchline of another story, saying he still balanced his checkbook by hand, like an old man, while everyone laughed politely. My mother called him charmingly outdated, but Peter muttered that at least Ethan was responsible and dependable, and I shot him a glare across the table, daring him to challenge me further. Ethan looked at me once during that dinner, with a strange mixture of hurt and calm resolve, before turning his eyes back to his plate. I dismissed it as him being too sensitive, yet later I would realize he was already withdrawing into a silence far stronger than any shouting could have been. By then, I was too caught up in the thrill of my secret to notice the shift around me. I told myself Jake was harmless fun, and Ethan was just jealous, and that I was entitled to some admiration after all the years I spent sacrificing for our home and children. But every lie I told at work, every joke I made at Ethan's expense, every ringless finger I flashed in the office break room piled up like kindling, waiting for a spark. And that night, when Jake called again and Ethan passed me in the hallway, hearing my low laugh into the phone, I could see in his eyes that he was filing away every detail with the same quiet precision he used on his ledgers. He did not shout, he did not accuse, he simply let the silence stretch long enough that I felt the air between us change, though I convinced myself I was still in control. What I did not know was that Ethan's silence was the beginning of something much larger, and that while I was busy playing with fire at the office, he was already planning how to answer my lies in a way I could never undo. The first real crack between us showed up at a work dinner where Ethan had agreed to come along, even though he hated those events and usually avoided them whenever possible. But I insisted because I wanted Jake and everyone else to see that I had a husband who looked the part. We sat at a long table in an upscale restaurant filled with the chatter of colleagues and the sound of glasses clinking, and I positioned myself next to Jake with Ethan on my other side, so I could balance both worlds as if that was ever possible. The evening started with harmless small talk about projects and deadlines, but soon Jake asked what Ethan did for a living, and I shrugged lightly and said he was just an accountant, as though it was something dull and unimpressive compared to the glamorous work Jake and I supposedly shared. People laughed softly at my dismissive tone, and I saw Ethan's shoulders stiffen, but instead of stopping, I leaned into it by adding how he spent more time with numbers than with real people, which got another laugh around the table. Ethan tried to defend himself by mentioning the importance of his work, but I cut him off by saying the room didn't need a math lesson, and everyone laughed again, while Jake smirked at me with approval. I told myself in that moment that I was being witty and keeping the atmosphere light, but underneath I was humiliating Ethan in front of people he barely knew. When we left the restaurant later that night, Ethan walked a few steps ahead of me, and I could feel the distance he was creating, though I tried to convince myself he was just tired. At home, when he remained quiet, I told him he was imagining insults, and that he always took things too seriously, but he said nothing, and only gave me a look that made me feel strangely unsettled. The next morning, my sister Claire called to ask how the dinner went, because she had heard from a mutual acquaintance that I was making fun of Ethan in front of my boss, and she warned me that humiliating him publicly would destroy my marriage if I kept it up. I dismissed her warning by saying she was jealous that I had a successful boss who admired me and a husband who tolerated my humor, while she had neither, but I hung up feeling oddly defensive. My mother, Marion, meanwhile praised me for keeping things lively and said Ethan needed to lighten up because men like him always risked making their wives feel invisible. I clung to her words as justification because they fed the story I wanted to believe, but deep down, I knew Peter would never have approved of what I did. At the next family dinner, Peter barely spoke to me except for one moment when he quietly asked if I was proud of myself after what he had heard, and I snapped back that I didn't need his lectures about marriage. Ethan kept his head down during that meal, barely engaging, and I convinced myself that meant he had already moved on from the embarrassment, but in reality, he was watching and waiting. At work, Jake mentioned how confident I had seemed at the restaurant, and I laughed and told him I had to play the part of a strong, independent woman because my husband was too quiet to keep up with me. He seemed amused and told me I was braver than most women he knew, and I felt a thrill at his words, forgetting that Ethan had once praised me just the same before I learned to roll my eyes at him. That night, when I returned home late after staying behind for drinks with coworkers, Ethan asked how long I planned to keep prioritizing other people over my family, and I told him he was overreacting and making problems out of nothing. He did not argue further, but simply nodded and went to bed early, leaving me sitting in the living room scrolling my phone and wondering why his silence felt heavier than any fight. I told myself again and again that he was being sensitive, that he should be grateful I was even including him in my professional world, but something about the calm way he looked at me before leaving the room made me uneasy. It was as if he had already decided that the real fight would not happen in words, but somewhere else entirely. And for the first time, I wondered if maybe I had gone too far in front of Jake and everyone else. Yet even then, I chose pride over caution, and convinced myself I still held all the control. By the time whispers started at the office, I was already too deep in my lies to stop, and the thrill of hiding my marriage gave me a sense of power I refused to let go of. One afternoon, a colleague leaned close and said people were noticing how often Jake and I slipped away together for long meetings that somehow never appeared on the calendar. And I laughed it off by saying we just worked well as a team, but I could see the suspicion in her eyes. That evening, Ethan asked why I had been working so late, and I brushed him off with a tired smile, saying the company was demanding more of me now, but inside I felt cornered by his steady gaze, as if he already knew more than he was saying. When he pressed again a few days later, I accused him of being paranoid and asked if he didn't trust me anymore, which immediately shifted the weight onto him because I knew he hated feeling like the bad guy for asking questions. That tactic worked for a while since he withdrew into silence instead of pushing harder, but I underestimated how much he noticed. At a birthday gathering for one of the children, Peter finally confronted me in front of everyone by saying my choices were reckless and humiliating, and that Ethan deserved better, while I snapped back that he should worry about his own marriage, instead of sticking his nose into mine. My mother rushed to defend me, saying Peter was overreacting and that Ethan needed to show more strength if he wanted to keep up with a woman like me, while Claire sat in the corner, looking both angry and sad at the same time. Ethan remained calm through the entire scene, cutting the cake for the children and helping clear dishes, while I seethed at being challenged, but his quietness only unsettled me more because it felt deliberate. Back at the office, I started catching Jake looking less comfortable whenever we lingered too long together in the hallways, and he even suggested we should be careful about appearances, but I brushed him off, saying people would always gossip. I clung to the belief that I could still juggle everything if I stayed confident, but Ethan was already pulling away in ways I didn't see. One evening, I returned home to find him sitting at the table with his laptop open and papers neatly stacked as though he had been working, but when I asked, he only said he was catching up on things for the week. I didn't realize until much later that he was collecting evidence quietly and carefully, with the same precision he always brought to his work. Even when I mocked him for being predictable, he was already building something solid, while I was balancing everything on shifting lies. A week later, I heard from another colleague that Ethan had been seen waiting outside a downtown hotel, just as Jake and I walked out together, and though I laughed it off in public, I panicked inside, knowing how careful Ethan could be when he set his mind on something. That night, he asked again if I was happy, and I snapped that he was suffocating me with his questions, and that he should be grateful I was loyal, when I easily could have left him for someone more exciting. I saw something shift in his face then, not anger, but a kind of final decision that scared me more than shouting ever would have. I went to bed convinced he would calm down, but the next morning, he kissed the children goodbye and left for work without saying a word to me, and the silence felt heavier than anything we had faced before. Even then, I clung to my story, telling myself he was weak and insecure, and that I still had control. But in reality, the balance was already tipping, and the evidence he had quietly gathered was about to unravel every lie I thought I had secured. The breaking point came during the school fundraiser, when the entire community was gathered in the brightly lit gym decorated with banners and balloons, and I convinced myself it would be the perfect place to show that I was admired by more than just my family. I wore a new dress that Jake had once complimented, and I made sure to stand near him during the event, even though Ethan had come along with the children and was quietly handling raffle tickets and helping the staff set up tables. Parents and teachers circled around making small talk, and I slipped Jake into the conversation whenever I could, laughing too loudly at his comments, while Ethan stood a little apart, listening but not speaking. When a group of parents asked about our work, Jake praised my dedication, and I basked in it while brushing off Ethan's contributions by saying he was good with numbers, but not much of a people person, which drew polite smiles, but left Ethan staring at the floor. I leaned over to him at one point and told him under my breath that he was embarrassing me by sulking instead of joining in, and he gave me a calm look before walking away toward the snack table without a word. Claire happened to be volunteering at the event, and later pulled me aside to say I was making Ethan look small in front of everyone, but I waved her off, claiming she didn't understand what it was like to be stuck with a husband who lacked presence. My mother arrived late, and when I told her what Claire had said, she rolled her eyes and reminded me that Ethan had always been too stiff, and that it was my right to shine when he refused to. Still, I noticed the way other parents whispered and glanced between Ethan and me, and I felt a flicker of discomfort that I quickly buried with more laughter at Jake's side. By the end of the night, Ethan excused himself quietly, saying he had to get the children home, while I stayed behind, helping Jake gather some leftover materials and chatting with colleagues as though nothing was wrong. When I returned later, the house felt strangely neat, in a way that unsettled me. The children were asleep, the counters were cleared, and the usual piles of mail and papers were missing from the table. Ethan was nowhere to be seen, and when I looked through the drawers, I realized certain folders and documents were gone, along with the laptop he always used for work. A chill ran through me, though I tried to convince myself he had simply taken things to the office early, but deep down, I knew he was moving with purpose. The next morning, he barely spoke at breakfast, serving cereal to the children and reminding them about their school projects, while addressing me only when absolutely necessary, and always with clipped politeness. I told myself I would confront him later and demand he stop acting so distant, but part of me already sensed that the silence was no longer a simple withdrawal, but the sign of something being built behind the scenes. That evening, I overheard him on the phone, speaking in a calm, steady voice about scheduling and documentation, and though he lowered his tone when I entered the room, I recognized enough phrases to realize he was speaking with a lawyer. My first instinct was to accuse him of overreacting, but something in his measured expression made me hesitate, because it no longer looked like anger or jealousy but strategy. I tried to distract myself by telling my mother and sister exaggerated stories about Ethan being controlling and cold, hoping they would side with me, but even Claire said quietly that maybe I'd gone too far this time, while my mother brushed it off, as Ethan finally showing his true colors. By then, I knew he had taken more than just papers. He had taken control of the story I thought I owned, and the thought of him calmly planning in the shadows while I laughed too loudly at Jake's side haunted me in ways I could not admit. The fundraiser should have been just another night of me basking in attention, but instead, it became the moment when Ethan stepped fully out of the role of quiet victim and into something else entirely, leaving me to realize far too late that my performance had set the stage for my own undoing. The truth finally landed at my doorstep in the most ordinary way possible, when a courier rang the bell one afternoon and handed me a large envelope with Ethan's lawyer's name neatly printed across the front, and for a moment, I just stood there staring at it like it might burn my hands. Inside were documents outlining custody considerations, financial protections, and detailed accounts of my behavior, complete with dates, times, and even copies of messages that I had thought were private between Jake and me. Ethan had not shouted, he had not begged, he had not even argued. Instead, he had built a wall of facts so solid that my excuses could barely scratch it. I skimmed through the pages and felt sick when I realized he had gathered everything quietly, while I was busy laughing at his expense. Later that evening, when he came home, he said nothing beyond reminding the children about homework and bedtime, while I demanded to know why he was doing this, and he only replied that everything would be explained through the proper channels. I tried to twist it by telling my mother that Ethan was trying to control me and punish me for being ambitious, and Marion immediately agreed, saying men always turned cruel when their pride was hurt. But when Peter heard the news, he called Ethan strong for finally standing up for himself, and even Claire told me that maybe this was the only way to make me understand what I had done. I tried calling Jake to lean on him for reassurance, but he grew distant once I mentioned legal trouble, and reminded me that he could not risk his own position if things got messy, which stung more than I wanted to admit. I told myself he was only being careful, but the truth was that Jake had been a distraction, not a partner, and when real consequences arrived, he stepped back without hesitation. I spent days pacing the house, insisting to anyone who would listen that Ethan was being dramatic and unfair, but every time I looked at the documents on the table, I knew deep down that he had acted with precision, not drama. He had frozen accounts, secured records, and even requested formal custody reviews, all through legal processes I could not twist into accusations of jealousy or insecurity. My usual tricks of gaslighting and shifting blame no longer worked because Ethan refused to engage outside the structure of the law, and his silence robbed me of the arguments I relied on. Even at family gatherings, he carried himself with a calm dignity, while I fumed about betrayal and control, leaving others to quietly side with him because his composure contrasted so sharply with my defensive outbursts. I tried to insist to the children that their father was being unreasonable, but Ethan never spoke badly of me in front of them, and his quiet patience only made my words sound bitter. Each night, I stared at the pile of evidence, wondering how I had been so blind to his strength, and yet I kept clinging to the story that I was still the victim. What unsettled me most was not just the paperwork, but the realization that Ethan had built an entire strategy without my noticing, while I had been so sure he was weak and oblivious. For the first time, I felt the ground tilt beneath me, because I had always believed I could talk my way out of anything. But now I was trapped inside a process that cared nothing for my excuses. The silence at home grew heavier with each passing day until it felt like a verdict in itself, and I knew the next step would no longer be papers delivered to my door, but a public reckoning where my lies would be laid bare for everyone to see. The day of the hearing arrived, and I walked into the courtroom wearing the best suit I owned, trying to project confidence, even though my stomach twisted with fear, because I knew Ethan had built something I could no longer control. The room was bright and orderly, filled with the quiet shuffle of papers and the steady voices of officials who cared nothing about my justifications or my charm. Ethan sat across from me, calm and steady, with his lawyer beside him, while I tried to keep my head high, though every glance from the gallery reminded me that people were watching to see if the stories they had heard were true. When the judge asked questions, Ethan's lawyer laid out every piece of evidence with precision: hotel records, messages, copies of emails, and even testimony from colleagues who had seen more than I ever thought they noticed. I tried to explain that I had been lonely, that Ethan made me feel invisible, and that I'd only wanted to feel alive again, but the judge's face remained neutral and unmoved, as if my words were just another excuse. Ethan never raised his voice, never showed anger. He simply let the facts speak for themselves, and in that silence, I realized he had already regained what I had tried to take from him, his dignity. My mother shifted uncomfortably beside me when the judge asked about the children's stability, and Ethan calmly explained his plans for their schooling schedules and care, showing that he had thought of everything while I sat there scrambling for words. That sounded shallow compared to his preparation. Claire avoided my eyes, and Peter gave Ethan a small nod of approval when the lawyer finished, as though this was the justice he had been waiting to see. I wanted to shout that I had been misunderstood, that Jake had encouraged me, that Ethan had failed me first, but none of it mattered against the careful stack of evidence arranged neatly before the court. When the ruling came down, the judge sided with Ethan, granting him primary custody arrangements and financial safeguards to protect the children's future, while my influence was limited in ways that made my chest tighten with panic. I sat frozen in my chair, as Ethan gathered his papers with quiet efficiency, not once looking triumphant, only resolved, while the world I had built on lies collapsed around me. In that moment, I realized the man I had mocked for being too quiet had spoken louder than I ever could not, with jokes or charm, but with patience, evidence, and law, and there was nothing left for me to twist or undo. Don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and turn on the bell so you don't miss the next story. Write in the comments from which city you are watching, 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 watching.